Hey guys, tonight we're not excavating ancient ruins or deciphering forgotten languages in the usual sense. Instead, we're going to pull up a rather uncomfortable wooden chair, perhaps next to a smoky tallow candle, in a bustling, news-filled, and surprisingly sober public space that became the unlikely engine room for a revolution in thought. We're venturing into the heart of 17th and 18th century Europe, specifically into its coffee houses, those penny universities where the very ideas that would define the Age of Enlightenment were first brewed, debated, and disseminated. Imagine yourself pushing open a creaky door on a narrow London or Parisian street, the aroma of roasting coffee beans, a new, exotic, and invigorating scent, mingling with the sweet pungency of pipe tobacco and the low, earnest hum of countless conversations. This was where new worlds of ideas were being built, one small, bitter cup at a time. But be warned, you probably wouldn't survive a heated philosophical debate in one of these early establishments without a very quick wit, an ability to hold your own against some of the sharpest minds of the age, and absolutely no expectation of a comfortable armchair or a barista who remembers your name and your usual overly complicated order. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as we prepare to sip from the cup of history, I'd be truly delighted to know where you're all tuning in from tonight. Please share your location and local time in the comments below. It's always a genuine pleasure to see how far these sleepy historical narratives manage to travel. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself in Europe, somewhere in the early to mid-17th century. The world is a very different place, especially when it comes to public social life and the spaces available for intellectual exchange. Before the arrival of coffee and the coffee house, if you wanted to gather with others outside your own home or a formal university setting, if you were one of the very few with access to such an institution, your primary option was likely the local tavern or alehouse. Before the widespread popularization of coffee and tea in Europe, alcoholic beverages like beer, ale, and wine were consumed daily by people of all social classes and often all ages, partly due to frequently unsafe or unpalatable water supplies, but also because these drinks provided essential calories and were deeply ingrained in social and cultural traditions. Picture a typical tavern of this era. It's probably a dim, smoky, and often rather boisterous establishment. The air is thick with the smell of stale beer, wood smoke from the hearth, unwashed bodies, and perhaps the rather dubious aroma of whatever passed for the daily stew. The light is poor, coming from flickering tallow candles that gutter and drip, or perhaps a few smoky oil lamps. The clientele is a mix of local artisans, laborers, farmers, traveling merchants, and perhaps a few down-at-heel soldiers or students. Conversation flows. Yes, but it's conversation fueled by alcohol. While undoubtedly a place for camaraderie, for sharing local news or gossip, for striking deals, or for simple escapism, the typical tavern was not generally conducive to sustained, clear-headed, rational debate or deep intellectual inquiry. Arguments might be loud and passionate, but they were often more emotional than logical, and could easily spill over into physical altercations. Trying to discuss, say, Descartes' newfangled philosophy or the latest astronomical discoveries of Galileo amidst the clatter of pewter tankards, the strains of a drunken song and the occasional outbreak of fisticuffs would have been a significant challenge. I posit, and good sirs, a philosopher might begin, that cogito ergo sum implies, only to be interrupted by a tankard flying past his ear and a rousing chorus of "Down among the dead men." Not exactly the ideal Socratic dialogue. Intellectual life, for those inclined towards it, was often a more private or restricted affair. Universities were ancient and respected centers of learning, but they were largely the preserve of a small, clerical or elite male population, and their curriculum was often deeply traditional, focused on theology, classical texts, and scholastic philosophy, with less emphasis on the new experimental sciences that were beginning to stir. The salons that would later become famous in 18th century France were starting to emerge, but these were typically private gatherings in the homes of wealthy, often aristocratic patrons, accessible only to a select circle of literati, artists, and philosophers. Ideas, for most people, spread relatively slowly through books which were still expensive and accessible only to the literate minority, through sermons from the church pulpit which carried the weight of religious authority, or through personal correspondence among the educated. There were few truly public spaces where men, and it was almost exclusively men in these early days of public discourse from different walks of life, could gather relatively freely and affordably, specifically for the purpose of discussing news, ideas, and commerce in a sober and intellectually stimulating environment. This was the world, a world largely lubricated by alcohol, where public discourse was often boisterous and unstructured, and where dedicated spaces for broad, sober intellectual exchange were scarce, into which a new, exotic, and rather mysterious beverage was about to make its dramatic entrance. This bitter invention of Satan, as some early critics would call it, or this wine of Araby, as others more poetically termed it, was coffee. And it wouldn't just change drinking habits, it would help to change the very way people thought, talked, and interacted, fueling the intellectual ferment that we now call the Age of Enlightenment. A quirky or fringe tidbit from this pre-coffee era is that some medieval and early modern ales were very different from our modern, hop-stabilized beers. Before hops became widely adopted, a process that took centuries and varied by region, beers were often flavored and preserved with a complex mixture of herbs and spices known as gruit. The exact composition of gruit varied, but it could include things like bog myrtle, yarrow, heather, juniper, and various other botanicals, some of which might have had mildly psychoactive or medicinal effects. This means that the ale-fueled conversations of the past might have had an even more unpredictable or groggy quality than we might imagine, depending on what exactly was in the local brew that day. Imagine trying to conduct a serious business negotiation when your ale is subtly convincing you that you can talk to squirrels. Historians continue to debate the precise overall impact of widespread daily low-level alcohol consumption, often through small beer with low alcohol content, but consumed in large quantities as a primary source of hydration, on the cognitive functions, general public health, and overall labor productivity of pre-coffee European societies. Some argue it fostered necessary conviviality and provided essential calories in often nutrient-poor diets, while others suggest it may have contributed to a general state of societal fogginess or dampened the potential for sustained intellectual vigor and innovation, at least until coffee and tea offered a widely available stimulant alternative. It's a fascinating what-if to consider. Would the scientific revolution have taken quite the same course if its early protagonists were primarily mulling over their theories after their third pint of morning ale, rather than their third cup of invigorating coffee? So, as you settle into this sleepy historical atmosphere, imagine this Europe on the cusp of a caffeinated awakening. The taverns are full, the ale is flowing, and thoughts, while perhaps not always crystal clear, are certainly brewing. But a new bean is on its way. A bean that will help to clear the haze, sharpen the wits, and create entirely new spaces for the kind of conversation that would soon begin to change the world. You're now comfortably situated in that pre-caffeinated European world, a place where the social hum often had an alcoholic undertone, and intellectual debates might have been more spirited in volume than in clarity. But change was brewing, quite literally. A new, dark, and mysterious beverage, with an exotic aroma and an even more intriguing reputation, was beginning to make its way from distant, sun-drenched lands into the bustling ports and curious minds of Europe. This was coffee, a bean that would not only transform waking hours but also the very spaces where people gathered to think and talk. Let's now trace the aromatic and often adventurous westward trek of this mysterious bean, from its legendary origins in Africa and its established café culture in the Middle East, to its arrival and gradual embrace in European cups. The story of coffee's origins is like many ancient tales, shrouded in a bit of legend and folklore, but the general consensus points to the highlands of Ethiopia as its likely birthplace. The most famous story, though probably apocryphal, tells of a 9th century goatherd named Caldi. One day, Caldi noticed his goats becoming unusually frisky and energetic after nibbling on the bright red berries of a certain unfamiliar bush. Curious, Caldi tried the berries himself and experienced a similar exhilarating effect, a newfound alertness and vigor. He shared his discovery with the abbot of a local monastery, who, after some initial suspicion, perhaps thinking it was some kind of devilish stimulant, found that roasting and brewing the beans produced a drink that helped the monks stay awake and focused during their long hours of prayer. Whether Caldi and his dancing goats are fact or charming fiction, Ethiopia is widely recognized as the ancestral home of the coffee arabica plant. From Ethiopia, the knowledge and cultivation of coffee is believed to have spread across the Red Sea to Yemen, in the southern Arabian Peninsula, perhaps as early as the 15th century. It was in Yemen, particularly in the Sufi Muslim communities, that coffee drinking as we might recognize it truly began to flourish. Sufi mystics reportedly used the brew to help them stay awake and attentive during their long nocturnal religious ceremonies and meditative practices. The port of Mocha in Yemen became a major center for coffee cultivation and trade, its name becoming synonymous with high-quality coffee for centuries. You can almost smell that first hint of roasting beans, a rich, earthy, slightly bitter aroma, a world away from the sweet, malty scent of European ale. Brother Hassan, one Sufi might say to another cup of this wondrous qahwa before the midnight dhikr. It truly helps one to contemplate the divine without accidentally face-planting into one's prayer mat. From Yemen, coffee consumption spread rapidly throughout the Arab world and the vast Ottoman Empire during the 16th century. Early coffee houses, known as kahve khane, became prominent social and cultural institutions in major cities like Mecca, Cairo, Damascus, and especially the Ottoman capital, Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul. These were revolutionary spaces in their own right, long before coffee houses appeared in Europe. They were places where men from various walks of life, though generally not women in public, could gather to drink coffee. Smoke tobacco, another recent arrival from the New World, engage in conversation, play games like chess and backgammon, listen to storytellers or poets, and discuss news, politics, and business. These Middle Eastern coffee houses were, in many ways, the direct precursors and models for their later European counterparts, offering a public space for social interaction and information exchange that was not centered around alcohol or religious ritual. The mainstream historical fact is that coffee was introduced to Europe primarily in the 17th century through extensive trade networks with the Ottoman Empire, with the bustling port city of Venice being one of the earliest and most significant major entry points for the bean into the European continent, followed by other trading hubs like Amsterdam and Marseille. European travelers, merchants, diplomats, and scholars who journeyed to the Ottoman Empire in the late 16th and early 17th centuries encountered these coffee houses and this intriguing new beverage. And they brought back stories, and eventually, samples of the coffee beans themselves. Imagine their initial reactions. Here was a drink that was dark, almost black, often served hot, strong, and unfiltered, much like modern Turkish coffee, with the fine grounds settling at the bottom of the small cup. It had a bitter, pungent taste and a powerful, unique aroma, quite unlike anything commonly consumed in Europe at the time. And its effects were even more remarkable. It banished drowsiness, sharpened the mind, stimulated conversation, and seemed to promote a state of alert sociability. This was a far cry from the often soporific or boisterous effects of ale or wine. The initial perception of coffee in Europe was a mixture of curiosity, fascination, and, inevitably, some suspicion. It was an exotic import from the infidel lands of the Turks, which automatically made it suspect in some religious and political circles. Its dark color and bitter taste led some to denounce it as a bitter invention of Satan or a hellish black broth. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that there's a popular, though likely apocryphal, story that when coffee first arrived in Venice, some priest urged Pope Clement VIII, who reigned 1592-1605, to ban it as a demonic Muslim drink. However, the Pope, upon tasting it himself, supposedly found it so delicious and invigorating that he baptized it, declaring it a Christian beverage, thus paving the way for its wider acceptance. Whether this papal tasting session actually happened or not, it captures the way coffee had to overcome initial cultural and religious resistance in some quarters. "Your Holiness," a nervous cardinal might have said, "this dark, strange brew from the lands of the Sultan." It makes one feel surprisingly alert during afternoon vespers. Perhaps it is not entirely diabolical, or perhaps it is diabolically clever. The journey of the mysterious bean itself was a feat of early global trade. Coffee beans were typically shipped green unroasted from ports like Mocha in Yemen or Alexandria in Egypt, often via camel caravans to coastal trading posts, then by ship across the Mediterranean to European ports. Once in Europe, the beans would need to be roasted, a crucial step that develops their characteristic aroma and flavor, then ground, often by hand using mortars and pestles or small hand-cranked mills in the early days. The brewing methods were also evolving. Early European preparations often involved boiling the ground coffee with water, sometimes for extended periods, producing a very strong, often muddy concoction. The addition of sugar, another increasingly available though still expensive exotic import from colonial plantations, helped to make coffee more palatable to European tastes. Milk would come later as a common addition for most. The slow but steady spread of coffee consumption in Europe began primarily among a few select groups merchants who had encountered it in their travels. Scholars and intellectuals who appreciated its mind-sharpening effects, it was sometimes sold in apothecaries as a medicinal tonic, and wealthy aristocrats who were always eager for new and exotic luxuries. It was initially an expensive commodity, a drink for the privileged few. But as trade routes expanded and import volumes increased, the price gradually began to fall, making it accessible to a wider segment of the urban population. The exact timeline and the primary overland and maritime routes for coffee's initial diffusion into different parts of Western and Central Europe, and the specific individuals, merchant companies like the Dutch or English East India companies, or diplomatic missions most responsible for its early popularization and the establishment of the first coffee-serving venues, are still subjects of detailed historical research and undoubtedly varied significantly by region and local commercial connections. But the bean had arrived. Its rich aroma was beginning to permeate the alleyways of Venice, the quays of Amsterdam, the scholarly enclaves of Oxford, and the bustling commercial heart of London. And with it came not just a new beverage, but the seeds of a new kind of social institution, a new public space that would soon become a crucible for the very ideas that would define the Age of Enlightenment. The stage was set for the rise of the European coffee house. The mysterious aromatic coffee bean has made its exotic westward trek from the highlands of Ethiopia and the bustling cafes of the Ottoman Empire, finally arriving on the shores of Europe. Initially a curious luxury, a medicinal tonic, or perhaps even a bitter invention of Satan to some. Its undeniable appeal, that unique ability to sharpen the mind, banish drowsiness, and fuel lively conversation, soon began to win over a growing number of European city dwellers. And with the increasing availability of coffee beans came the natural next step, the establishment of dedicated public spaces for their preparation and consumption. These were the very first European coffee houses, novel establishments that would quickly evolve from mere curiosities into vital hubs of social, intellectual, and commercial life. Let's now push open the door of one of these pioneering establishments, perhaps in mid-17th century London, and take our first sips from the Penny University. While Venice, due to its extensive trade links with the Eastern Mediterranean, was one of the very earliest European cities to encounter coffee, perhaps as early as the late 16th century, with the first public coffee vendor recorded there around 1645, and cities like Oxford with its scholarly community also saw very early coffee houses. It was arguably London that truly embraced and popularized the coffee house as a widespread social institution in the mid-17th century. The first coffee houses in London, appearing around 1650-1652, one famously opened by an Armenian immigrant named Pasqua Rosé in St. Michael's Alley. Cornhill quickly became incredibly popular public spaces for social interaction, the consumption and discussion of news, business dealings, and lively intellectual debate. They soon earned the affectionate and highly descriptive nickname Penny Universities. Yeah, this evocative term tells us a great deal about their perceived value and accessibility. For the modest price of 1 penny, a customer could gain admission to the coffee house, purchase a dish, a small bowl, or cup of the stimulating new beverage, and, most importantly, gain access to a wealth of information, conversation, and intellectual stimulation that was often unavailable elsewhere. especially to those outside the traditional confines of universities or elite private salons. A penny for a coffee, and a pound's worth of wit and wisdom in return. A satisfied patron might exclaim, though I do suspect the wisdom part varies greatly depending on who's holding forth by the fireplace today. Imagine stepping inside one of these early London coffee houses. The scene would be a stark contrast to the often boisterous, ale-fueled atmosphere of a traditional tavern. The layout might be relatively simple, a long room, perhaps paneled in dark wood, with plain wooden tables and benches or stools. The air would be thick with the aroma of roasting coffee beans, as some establishments roasted their own beans on the premises to ensure freshness and attract customers with the enticing smell and the rich, slightly bitter scent of brewing coffee. This would mingle with the ubiquitous haze of pipe smoke, as tobacco was another popular new import and a common accompaniment to coffee drinking and conversation. The sounds would be primarily those of human voices, a constant, energetic hum of conversation, punctuated by earnest debate, occasional laughter, the rustle of printed news sheets, and the clatter of coffee cups. It was an atmosphere of animated, yet generally sober, intellectual ferment. You wouldn't usually find a raucous sing-along or a drunken brawl in a well-run coffee house. The emphasis was on discourse, not debauchery. The clientele was a key part of what made these early coffee houses so revolutionary. While not entirely democratic in the modern sense, they were still predominantly male spaces, and entry, while cheap, still excluded the very poorest. They did attract a remarkably diverse range of men from different social strata and professions. You might find merchants and ship captains discussing the latest arrivals in the Port of London, commodity prices, and overseas ventures. Clerks and scriveners from nearby counting houses might be taking a break, networking, or catching up on business news. Lawyers and their clients could be seen conferring over legal documents. Aspiring writers, poets, and pamphleteers would gather to share their latest works, critique others, and seek out patrons or publishers. Students and scholars from the Inns of Court or nearby Gresham College, a center for the new science, might be passionately debating the latest philosophical ideas or scientific discoveries. Even some gentlemen of leisure or curious aristocrats might drop in to sample the coffee and the conversation. This mingling of different social groups, all engaged in relatively free and open discussion, was a novel and powerful feature of the coffee house. It was a place where a humble clerk might find himself seated next to a wealthy merchant, listening to a debate between a clergyman and a scientist, all for the price of a penny. A crucial function of these penny universities was as centers for accessing information. In an age before daily mass circulation newspapers, coffee houses became vital hubs for reading the latest news sheets, pamphlets, gazettes, newsletters often handwritten and circulated, and political tracts. A coffee house owner would subscribe to these publications, and patrons could read them for free or for a nominal fee, often passing them from table to table. This was a huge draw. It meant that even those who couldn't afford to buy every new pamphlet could stay informed about current events, political developments, commercial news, and even foreign affairs. Notices, advertisements, auction announcements, and shipping news might also be posted on the walls or on a dedicated notice board. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some of these early coffee houses essentially functioned as informal post offices. Patrons could leave letters for others to collect, or use the coffee house as a recognized address for receiving mail, especially if they were new to the city or didn't have a permanent residence. The coffee house keeper might even help to facilitate this, becoming a trusted node in the city's information network. Any mail for Philosophicus Ignotus? A mysterious gentleman in a dark cloak might inquire of the coffee boy. I'm expecting an urgent dispatch concerning the true nature of phlogiston. And another coffee, if you please. Extra strong. But beyond just passively consuming information, the coffee house was a place for actively discussing and debating it. This was its true revolutionary power. The coffee itself, being a stimulant that sharpened the mind and encouraged wakefulness, was the perfect fuel for these extended conversations. Unlike the tavern, where alcohol might cloud judgment or lead to emotional outbursts, the coffee house fostered a culture of ideally more rational, sober, and sustained discourse. Patrons would gather around tables, often in groups with shared interests, and engage in lively discussions about everything from the price of wool and the latest parliamentary debates to the theories of Descartes, the discoveries of Boyle and Hooke, or the merits of a new poem by Dryden. Many coffee houses even had rules of the house posted, often in verse encouraging civil discourse, respect for others' opinions even if you disagreed vehemently, and a commitment to seeking truth through reasoned argument. These rules might prohibit swearing, loud or boisterous behavior, gambling for high stakes, or discussions that could lead to physical violence. The aim was to create an environment conducive to polite and productive conversation, a school of urbanity where men could learn to debate and exchange ideas in a relatively orderly fashion. The degree to which these early English coffee houses were truly democratic spaces that actively fostered social leveling and entirely free speech, versus still subtly reflecting and reinforcing existing social hierarchies through unwritten codes of conduct, preferred seating arrangements for wealthier patrons, or the natural formation of exclusive conversational cliques based on profession or status, is a topic of ongoing and rich discussion among social historians of the period. The ideal of open access and free debate was certainly there, but the realities of a deeply hierarchical society would inevitably have shaped the experience. So, as you find yourself in this bustling, smoky, aromatic, penny university, surrounded by the eager hum of voices and the rustle of freshly printed news, you are witnessing the birth of a new kind of public sphere. It's a place where, for the price of a single coin, you could not only get a cup of the invigorating new brew called coffee, but also an education in current affairs, a chance to engage in stimulating debate, and a front row seat to the intellectual ferment that was beginning to bubble and percolate, fueling the very engine of the Enlightenment. Just try not to spill your coffee on Isaac Newton's preliminary notes for the Principia Mathematica. He might get a bit grumpy. We've taken our first sips from a cup of history in an early London penny university, those novel establishments that were beginning to transform the social and intellectual landscape of 17th century Europe. But to truly appreciate their impact and why they became such potent crucibles for the ideas of the Enlightenment, we need to immerse ourselves a little more deeply in their unique atmosphere, get to know their diverse clientele, and understand the unwritten and sometimes explicitly written rules that governed life within their stimulating, smoke-filled walls. What was the actual vibe of a typical Enlightenment-era coffee house, say in London, Paris, or Amsterdam? During its heyday, it was a rich sensory tapestry, a dynamic social experiment, and a place where the simple act of drinking a hot, bitter beverage became a catalyst for profound change. Let's push open that imaginary coffeehouse door again. Perhaps on a damp London morning in the 1680s, or a crisp Parisian afternoon in the early 1700s. The first sensation to greet you is likely the aroma. The predominant smell would, of course, be that of coffee itself. Many coffee houses roasted their own beans on the premises, often in a large open fireplace or a dedicated roasting drum. This process would fill the air with a rich, pungent, sometimes slightly acrid, but undeniably invigorating scent, a fragrance that was still relatively new and exotic to European noses. This would mingle with the aroma of freshly ground coffee often done by hand with a mortar and pestle or a small mill, and the slightly different, perhaps more mellow, scent of coffee actually brewing, likely in large pots over a brazier or hearth. Add to this the almost ubiquitous smell of burning pipe tobacco. Clay pipes were constant companions for many men in this era, and the sweet, earthy, or sometimes acrid aroma of various tobacco blends would have been a thick, ever-present haze in most coffee houses. And beneath these dominant scents, you might detect fainter notes: the smell of ink and paper from the numerous newspapers, pamphlets, and handwritten newsletters being passed around, perhaps a hint of damp wool from patrons' cloaks on a rainy day, and the general, unspecific but always present, aroma of a crowded room full of human beings who bathed somewhat less frequently than we might prefer today. It was a complex, but undoubtedly stimulating, olfactory environment. Not exactly a modern artisanal coffee shop with its single-origin pour-overs and a strict no-smoking policy, more like a robust, working think tank fueled by caffeine and nicotine. "I'll have a dish of your finest Turkish grounds," a patron might call out. and another ounce of that Virginia tobacco that smells suspiciously like old socks, but has a surprisingly philosophical aftertaste. The sounds of the coffee house would be a constant, energetic hum. The primary sound, of course, but was conversation. Dozens, perhaps hundreds, of voices engaged in discussions, debates, arguments, storytelling, the sharing of news, or simply quiet tete-a-tetes. It wouldn't necessarily be a deafening roar, though it could get quite loud at peak times, but more of a sustained, multi-layered murmur, like a beehive of intellectual activity. Interspersed with this would be the rustling of newspapers and pamphlets as they were passed from hand to hand. The clatter of small ceramic coffee cups, often handleless bowls in the early days, being set down on wooden tables. The occasional striking of a public clock if the establishment was grand enough to possess one, or if a nearby church clock could be heard. The thump of a dice cup if some discreet gambling was tolerated. And perhaps the authoritative voice of someone reading aloud from a fresh news sheet for the benefit of those who couldn't read or couldn't get their hands on a copy. It was the soundtrack of a city thinking, talking, and caffeinating. Visually, the early coffee houses were often dimly lit, especially during the day when sunlight struggled to penetrate small, perhaps grimy, windows, or in the evenings when illumination depended entirely on flickering tallow candles or smoky oil lamps. The interiors were usually functional rather than luxurious, long communal tables made of plain wood, surrounded by simple benches, stools, or perhaps a few more comfortable settles or high-backed chairs for favored patrons, or those willing to pay a little extra for a prime spot near the fire in winter. The walls might be paneled in dark wood, or perhaps whitewashed. They were often adorned with posted advertisements, public notices, manuscript newsletters, maps of the city or the world, satirical prints, or even lists of rules of the house. The bar or coffee-making area might be a simple counter at one end of the room, with large copper or tin coffee pots bubbling over a charcoal brazier, and a kidney, the coffee house keeper's boy or assistant, scurrying about, taking orders, making change, and delivering the steaming dishes of coffee. Mainstream historical fact Enlightenment-era coffee houses in major European cities like London and Paris were characterized by a unique and highly stimulating social atmosphere that actively encouraged the free exchange of information, access to a wide variety of printed news and political tracts, and lively, often passionate, debate among a diverse, though predominantly male and largely middle to upper-class urban clientele. The clientele, as we've noted, was a key part of the coffee house vibe. While certainly not open to everyone in society, the very poor would likely not have the penny for admission or the leisure time to spend there. And women, for the most part, were excluded from participating in this public male sphere. A point we'll return to. Coffee houses did attract a broader cross-section of urban men than most other contemporary social institutions. You would find merchants and businessmen discussing trade routes, commodity prices, insurance rates. Lloyd's of London famously began in a coffee house, and investment opportunities. Ship captains and sailors might share news from distant ports. Writers, poets, pamphleteers, and aspiring wits like Addison and Steele, whose Tatler and Spectator journals were famously associated with London coffeehouse culture, would gather to try out new ideas, critique each other's work, and observe the human comedy around them for inspiration. Philosophers and scientists, natural philosophers as they were then called, would meet to debate the latest theories of Descartes, Newton, Locke, or Leibniz, or to discuss new experiments and discoveries. Students from nearby universities or professional schools would flock to coffee houses for a more informal and stimulating intellectual environment than their formal studies sometimes provided. Clerks, shopkeepers, artisans, and even some more prosperous tradesmen could also be found, eager to catch up on the news, network, or simply enjoy a dish of coffee and a pipe of tobacco in a convivial, if intellectually charged, atmosphere. Politicians and their agents certainly frequented coffee houses, using them to gauge public opinion, spread propaganda, or engage in discreet or not-so-discreet political maneuvering. A quirky or fringe tidbit that highlights the coffee house's role as an information hub is that some establishments had a special box, often prominently placed near the entrance or the serving counter, with a sign that read something like "to ensure prompt service" or "to ensure promptness." Patrons wishing for quicker attention from the busy coffee boy or perhaps wanting to contribute to the general upkeep of the newspapers and amenities, could drop a coin into this box. This is one of the most charming, if historically debated and likely apocryphal, proposed origins of our modern English term to tip, or leaving a tip. Whether true or not, it underscores the idea that the coffee house was a place of exchange, not just of ideas, but also of small courtesies and services. The coffee itself was, of course, central to the experience. In the early days, it was often prepared in the Turkish style, very finely ground coffee boiled with water and sometimes sugar in a pot called an ibrik or kasve, then poured, grounds and all, into small, handleless ceramic bowls or cups. It would be strong, dark, often slightly gritty towards the bottom, and usually consumed black, though sugar was increasingly available for those who preferred it. The ritual of slowly sipping this hot, bitter, stimulating beverage, often over a period of an hour or more while engaged in reading or conversation, was a key part of the coffee house culture. It was a drink that encouraged wakefulness, attentiveness, and prolonged social interaction. A stark contrast to the quicker, often more intoxicating, consumption of alcoholic beverages in a tavern. The actual level of consistent sobriety and purely rational, high-minded discourse that was always maintained in these coffee houses, versus the somewhat romanticized image that has come down to us, and the extent to which they were also, quite naturally, places for more mundane leisure. Simple gossip despite rules against it. Networking for purely personal gain, and other less lofty forms of social interaction, is a subject that social historians continue to assess by carefully examining contemporary diaries. Private letters, official surveillance reports as governments often worried about what was being said in these places, and the satirical literature and popular prints of the period. The reality was likely a vibrant, sometimes chaotic, mix of the profound and the profane, the philosophical and the practical, all buzzing under a haze of coffee steam and tobacco smoke. It was, in short, a microcosm of the city itself, but one supercharged with caffeine and the thrill of new ideas. You're now comfortably settled in the stimulating, if somewhat smoky and noisy, atmosphere of an Enlightenment-era coffee house. You've absorbed the sights, the sounds, the unique aroma of roasting beans and brewing coffee mingling with pipe tobacco. You've observed the diverse clientele, merchants, writers, scientists, students, all deep in conversation or poring over the latest news sheets. But perhaps the most profound and revolutionary aspect of the coffee house phenomenon was not just the space itself, or even the information exchanged within it, but the very nature of the beverage that was its raison d'etre coffee. The introduction and widespread adoption of coffee as a popular social and daily drink marked a significant physiological and cultural shift in European society. A move away from a world largely hydrated and often sedated by alcohol, towards one increasingly fueled by the clear-headed alertness and intellectual stimulation provided by caffeine. Let's now gently explore how this sobering brew began to oust the traditional morning ale and fundamentally change the way people thought, worked, and interacted. To truly appreciate this shift, we need to recall the beverage landscape of pre-coffee Europe, which we touched upon in our first section. For centuries, alcoholic beverages, primarily ale and beer in Northern Europe, and wine in southern regions, had been the staple drinks for almost everyone, from peasant to prince, often including women and children who would typically consume small beer or heavily watered wine with very low alcohol content. As we noted, this wasn't necessarily due to a universal desire for constant inebriation, but often because water sources were frequently contaminated and unsafe to drink. The fermentation process involved in making beer and wine, and often the boiling of water in brewing, helped to kill harmful pathogens, making these beverages a safer, if not always healthier, alternative. Furthermore, these drinks provided essential calories and some nutrients, which could be significant in diets that were often otherwise meager or monotonous. Another pint of your finest questionable water, alternative. Goodman tavern keeper, a 16th century patron, might declare, "My doctor, who primarily prescribes leeches and prayers to obscure saints, says it's good for the humors, or at least it makes me forget about them for a while." But what were the effects of this pervasive alcohol consumption on daily life and intellectual activity? Even low alcohol beverages, when consumed regularly throughout the day from morning till night, as was common, would contribute to a certain level of chronic, low-grade intoxication, or at least a degree of mental fogginess for a significant portion of the population. While alcohol can certainly loosen tongues and foster conviviality as it did in taverns, it is fundamentally a depressant. It clouds judgment, slows reaction times, impairs memory and concentration, and can lead to drowsiness or, if consumed in larger quantities, aggression and irrational behavior. Imagine trying to conduct complex financial calculations, write a detailed philosophical treatise, or engage in a nuanced scientific debate when your primary source of hydration throughout the day has been ale. It's not impossible. Of course, people were clearly functional, but it's arguably not the optimal state for sustained, precise, clear-headed intellectual labor. Into this world. Then comes coffee and its active ingredient, caffeine. Caffeine is a stimulant. It promotes alertness, banishes drowsiness, sharpens focus and concentration, quickens reaction times, and can enhance mental clarity and the capacity for sustained intellectual effort. For a society on the cusp of the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, periods that would place an unprecedented emphasis on reason, empirical observation, critical thinking, and intense intellectual exchange, the arrival of a widely accessible beverage that actively supported these very mental states was nothing short of revolutionary. It was as if someone had suddenly switched the societal default beverage setting from gentle sedative to mild stimulant, with profound consequences. One of the most immediate impacts was on the morning draft. Before coffee, it was common for many people, including those engaged in scholarly or commercial pursuits, to start their day with a tankard of ale or small beer. This was partly for hydration and calories, but it hardly set the stage for a morning of peak mental acuity. Coffee offered a dramatic alternative. A hot, bitter, invigorating cup of coffee could dispel the morning fog, sharpen the wits, and prepare the mind for a day of work, study, or debate. Businessmen, clerks, writers, and scholars found that they could work longer, more focused hours, free from the drowsiness or muddle-headedness that might have accompanied their traditional morning ale. The mainstream historical fact is that the rise of coffee consumption in 17th and 18th century Europe, particularly in urban centers and among the burgeoning middle and professional classes, provided a significant and widely adopted alternative to alcoholic beverages for daily and social drinking. The stimulant properties of caffeine are thought by many historians to have contributed to increased productivity, enhanced mental clarity, and the kind of sustained, rational intellectual discourse that became a hallmark of the Age of Enlightenment and the scientific revolution. This shift had a profound impact on the nature of intellectual discourse itself. As coffee houses became the preferred venues for discussion and debate, the very tone and quality of that discourse began to change. Unlike the often emotionally charged, sometimes incoherent, and frequently interrupted conversations of an alehouse, the coffee house, fueled by its eponymous beverage, fostered an environment where sustained, reasoned argument and the critical examination of ideas could flourish. Participants were more likely to be alert, attentive, and capable of following complex lines of thought for extended periods. This was absolutely crucial for the dissemination and development of the new philosophical, scientific, and political ideas that characterize the Enlightenment. It's much easier to deconstruct Locke's theories on government or debate Newton's laws of motion if you're not simultaneously trying to remember where you left your other tankard of porter. Indeed, sir. One coffeehouse intellectual might remark to another, "Your refutation of Cartesian dualism is most cogent this morning. I suspect it's the excellent quality of this new batch of beans from Java, rather than the lingering effects of last night's particularly potent Stingo ale at the Dog and Duck." Coffee also contributed to what some have called the democratization of sobriety, though sobriety here is relative, as tobacco was still ubiquitous, and many coffeehouse patrons might still enjoy alcohol at other times. Coffee, especially in the penny universities, was relatively cheap and accessible to a broader range of urban men than, say, expensive imported wines or private scholarly tutors. This meant that the state of clear-headed alertness and the opportunity for informed discussion were no longer solely the preserve of the wealthy elite or the academic clergy. Merchants, artisans, clerks, and students could all participate in this new caffeinated public sphere. There were also perceived health benefits associated with coffee, at least by its proponents. In an age when humoral theory still held sway, coffee was sometimes seen as a drying and warming beverage that could counteract the cold and moist qualities associated with ale or certain ailments. It was praised for clearing the head, aiding digestion, though that's debatable for strong, black coffee on an empty stomach, and even for preventing sleepiness during long sermons, a benefit much appreciated by clergy and congregation alike. One imagines, while some of these perceived benefits were undoubtedly exaggerated or based on misunderstanding, the contrast with the known negative effects of excessive alcohol consumption, drunkenness, ill health, lost productivity was clear. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some of the earliest and most vociferous opponents of coffee in Europe were not just religious conservatives worried about its infidel origins, but also, unsurprisingly, brewers and tavern keepers, who saw this popular new non-alcoholic or at least non-intoxicating in the same way beverage and the coffee houses that served it as a direct threat to their centuries-old livelihood. They sometimes spread rumors that coffee was unhealthy, that it caused impotence or sterility, or that it would make people talk too much and neglect their work and families, the latter complaint. Ironically, was also leveled by some women against their coffee house frequenting husbands, who they felt were spending too much time and money on this newfangled addiction instead of being at home. There were even attempts in some places to tax coffee heavily or to restrict the number of coffee houses. Partly out of these economic concerns, the quantifiable, direct impact of this societal shift from predominantly alcohol-based daily hydration to the increased consumption of caffeinated beverages like coffee and tea, which also rose in popularity during this period on broader societal metrics such as overall economic productivity, rates of scientific innovation, or even public health outcomes in early modern Europe is, of course, an incredibly complex area of historical research, and establishing direct irrefutable causal links is exceptionally difficult, despite strong anecdotal, circumstantial, and logical evidence. It wasn't that everyone suddenly stopped drinking alcohol and became a hyper-productive, clear-thinking Enlightenment philosopher overnight. The transition was gradual, uneven, and alcohol certainly didn't disappear. But the introduction of coffee as a widely available, socially acceptable, and mentally stimulating alternative was undeniably a profound development. It helped to create a new rhythm for the day, a new fuel for the mind, and new spaces where a different kind of conversation could take place. The sobering brew didn't just wake people up in the morning, it helped to wake up an entire era, fostering the clarity, the critical engagement, and the sustained intellectual energy that would become the hallmarks of the Age of Enlightenment. The coffee bean, small and dark, packed a surprisingly powerful revolutionary punch. We've witnessed the arrival of that mysterious aromatic bean, coffee, a nut, into Europe. And we've stepped inside the doors of the first penny universities, those novel establishments where, for the price of a single copper coin, a man could get a dish of the stimulating new brew and immerse himself in a world of conversation and ideas. But these coffee houses were far more than just places to drink a hot beverage and chat. In an age before mass media as we know it, before the internet, before even daily, widely circulated newspapers for all, they rapidly evolved into absolutely vital hubs for the dissemination and consumption of news and information. They became the unofficial post offices, the reading rooms, and the living, breathing social networks of their day. Let's settle into a probably rather hard wooden bench. Try to find a spot where the pipe smoke isn't too thick, and observe how these coffee houses emerged as the critical information exchanges of the 17th and 18th centuries. One of the primary draws of the coffee house, beyond the coffee itself, was the unprecedented access it provided to printed materials. 17th and 18th century European coffee houses, particularly in major urban centers like London, Paris, and Amsterdam, served as vital centers for the dissemination of news and diverse information, providing patrons with relatively cheap and easy access to a wide variety of printed materials such as early newspapers, political pamphlets, gazettes, and commercial newsletters, which were often too expensive for individuals to purchase regularly. Imagine a time when a single printed news sheet might cost a significant portion of a working man's daily wage. Buying every pamphlet or gazette that caught your eye was simply not feasible for most people. Coffee house keepers, however, would subscribe to a range of these publications, both domestic and sometimes foreign, and make them available to their patrons, usually for no extra charge beyond the initial penny for coffee and admission. This was revolutionary. Suddenly, a much broader segment of the urban male population could keep abreast of current events, political debates, commercial news, and even literary and scientific developments. What's the news from the continent today? Goodman Thwaite. A merchant might ask, peering over another's shoulder at a freshly arrived copy of the Harlem Courant or the Gazette de l'Ede. Are the French still planning to invade Flanders? Or have they decided to just stick to inventing new and increasingly complicated sauces this season? These printed materials would be laid out on the long communal tables, or perhaps kept by the coffee house keeper and loaned out. It was common practice for patrons to share newspapers, passing them from one person to the next once they had finished reading a section. For those who were illiterate, and literacy rates, while rising, were still far from universal. A common and welcome practice was for one literate patron to read aloud from a particularly interesting news sheet or pamphlet for the benefit of the entire room, or at least for those gathered around his table. This transformed the act of news consumption from a solitary, private activity into a communal, participatory one, often sparking immediate discussion and debate. The types of printed matter available were diverse. There were early newspapers or news books, often published weekly or bi-weekly, containing summaries of domestic and foreign news, official pronouncements, and sometimes advertisements. There were countless political pamphlets and broadside single-printed sheets, especially during times of political turmoil like the English Civil War or the lead-up to the French Revolution, arguing for one faction or another, satirizing opponents, or proposing radical new ideas. There were commercial newsletters providing shipping news, commodity prices, and business intelligence, vital for merchants and traders. And there were literary journals, poetry collections, and even early forms of serialized fiction that might be found and discussed. Beyond printed materials, coffee houses also became crucial nodes in the circulation of manuscript newsletters and private correspondence. Before the advent of highly organized public postal systems, sending and receiving letters could be a haphazard affair. Coffee houses often served as informal post offices or mail drops. A traveler arriving in a city might leave a letter for a local resident at a designated coffee house, knowing that the recipient was likely to frequent that establishment or that the coffee house keeper would see it delivered. Or one might go to a particular coffee house known to be a hub for correspondence with a certain region or a specific group of people, like merchants trading with the Levant, or scholars connected to a particular university. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some well-known London coffee houses had specific letterboards or designated areas where patrons could post or collect their mail. The coffee house keeper might even charge a small fee for this service, or for forwarding letters. It was a vital part of the city's communication infrastructure. Imagine trying to manage your inbox when your inbox was literally a crowded corkboard in a smoky room. And spam was just a badly written political pamphlet someone kept trying to get you to read. And then, of course, there was the immense power of word-of-mouth news. The coffee house was the ultimate gossip central, but in this context, gossip often meant the rapid, informal transmission of fresh, often unverified, but sometimes critically important information. Travelers just arrived from other cities or foreign ports would share the latest news they had gathered on their journeys. Merchants would exchange intelligence about market conditions or the creditworthiness of other traders. Government clerks or minor officials might discreetly leak information about a new policy or a political scandal. Rumors, both true and false, would circulate with astonishing speed through the network of coffee houses in a major city like London or Paris. This informal news network was often faster, and sometimes more candid than the officially sanctioned printed news, which could be subject to censorship or government control. The actual reliability and accuracy of the news circulating in these early modern coffee houses, particularly the distinction between well-sourced word-of-mouth information, printed accounts which themselves could be biased or inaccurate, and outright unsubstantiated rumors or deliberate misinformation, and the extent to which patrons critically evaluated the diverse sources they encountered, is a complex area of ongoing historical investigation into the nature of early news cultures and the formation of public knowledge. It wasn't always easy to tell fact from fiction, but the sheer volume and variety of information available was unprecedented. This free-flowing exchange of news and views in the coffeehouse environment was central to the development of what the German philosopher Jürgen Habermas later termed the public sphere, a space where private individuals could come together to discuss matters of public concern, to form opinions, and to potentially exert influence on political and social life. Independent of, though often in tension with the official spheres of the state and the church, coffeehouses, with their relatively open access, their provision of information, and their culture of debate were prime examples of this emerging public sphere in action. The speed of information dissemination through this coffeehouse network could be remarkable for its time. A significant piece of political news arriving by ship in the morning might be known and hotly debated in coffeehouses across London by the afternoon, long before it appeared in any printed news sheet. This ability to rapidly share and discuss information was crucial for commerce, for political organization, and for the general intellectual dynamism of the era. The coffeehouse wasn't just a place to get a drink, it was a place to get informed, to connect, and to participate, however informally, in the great conversations of the age. It was the internet of its day, just a lot slower, a lot smokier, and with a much higher chance of spilling hot coffee on your neighbor's new periwig. We've now established the early modern coffeehouse as a unique and vital hub for accessing news, sharing information, and engaging in lively, if sometimes smoky, conversation. But beyond just keeping up with current events or facilitating business deals, these penny universities became something far more profound. They became the veritable crucibles, the intellectual breweries, for the very ideas that would define the Age of Enlightenment. It was within these caffeinated confines, over countless dishes of the bitter black brew, that new ways of thinking about science, philosophy, politics, religion, and human nature itself were passionately discussed, fiercely debated, and gradually disseminated into the wider culture. Let's now lean in closer to those crowded tables and try to catch the whispers, the arguments, and the aha moments as reason's brew, coffee, helped to percolate the transformative ideas of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment, that powerful intellectual and cultural movement that swept across Europe primarily in the 18th century, though its roots go back into the 17th, emphasized reason, rationality, empirical observation, and individualism as the primary tools for understanding the world and improving the human condition. It challenged traditional authorities, whether they be absolute monarchs, dogmatic churches, or ancient philosophical systems that were not based on evidence and critical inquiry. And the coffeehouse, with its unique atmosphere, provided an almost perfect environment for these new ideas to take root and flourish. Coffeehouses in the 17th and 18th centuries played a truly significant role in fostering the distinctive intellectual environment of the Age of Enlightenment, providing accessible public spaces where new and often challenging philosophical, scientific, and political ideas could be relatively freely discussed, rigorously debated, and effectively disseminated among a diverse and engaged urban public. What were some of the key Enlightenment ideas that might have been thrashed out over steaming cups of coffee? Reason and rationality. Thinkers like René Descartes, though, he predates the peak coffeehouse era. His influence was immense, with his famous cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, had championed the power of human reason to arrive at truth. John Locke, a pivotal Enlightenment figure and a known coffeehouse frequenter, argued for knowledge based on experience and sensory perception empiricism. In coffeehouses, patrons would debate these fundamental questions. How do we know what we know? What is the role of reason versus faith or tradition? Can human society be organized along rational principles? These weren't just abstract academic discussions. They had profound implications for how people understood themselves and their world. My dear sir, one gentleman in a periwig might exclaim to another across a coffee-stained table, your reliance on innate ideas is patently absurd. All knowledge, as the esteemed Mr. Locke so clearly demonstrates in his latest essay, which I happen to have a copy of right here. Freshly delivered from the bookseller down the lane, derives from sensory experience. Another dish of coffee? Boy, this debate requires further stimulation. Empiricism and the scientific method. The scientific revolution, which was gathering pace, emphasized observation, experimentation, and the formulation of natural laws based on evidence. Figures like Francis Bacon had laid the groundwork, and Isaac Newton's Principia Mathematica, published in 1687, provided a stunning example of the power of this new approach. Coffee houses, particularly those near scientific institutions like the Royal Society in London, became places where these new scientific ideas were eagerly discussed, explained, and sometimes even informally demonstrated or debated by the scientists themselves and interested laymen. Natural rights and social contract theory. Philosophers like John Locke argued that individuals possess inherent natural rights to life, liberty, and property, and that legitimate government is based on a social contract between the rulers and the ruled, with the consent of the governed. These were radical ideas that directly challenged the prevailing doctrines of absolute monarchy and the divine right of kings. In the relatively free atmosphere of a coffee house, such concepts could be explored, debated, and their revolutionary implications considered, often with a frisson of excitement and perhaps a touch of trepidation, given the watchful eyes of government spies in some establishments. Religious tolerance and deism. The Enlightenment also saw a growing critique of religious dogmatism, intolerance, and superstition. Thinkers like Voltaire, a famous Parisian café devotee, championed religious tolerance and freedom of thought. Deism, the belief in a rational creator. God, who established natural laws but does not intervene directly in human affairs, gained popularity among some intellectuals as a more reasonable alternative to traditional revealed religions. These sensitive, often dangerous topics could be discussed with a degree of candor in coffee houses that might be impossible elsewhere. Political reform and critiques of absolutism. Building on ideas of natural rights and the social contract, discussions in coffee houses frequently turn to the nature of good government, the limits of monarchical power, the rights of citizens or subjects, and the need for political reform. The coffee house became a space where nascent forms of political opposition and a critical public opinion could begin to coalesce. The very atmosphere of the coffee house and the physiological effects of coffee itself were conducive to this kind of intellectual ferment. As we've discussed, coffee, unlike alcohol, promotes alertness, clear thinking, and sustained mental effort. This allowed for longer, more focused, and more rational debates than were typically possible in an alehouse. The relatively open and diverse, though still predominantly male and middle to upper class clientele, meant that ideas could be exchanged between people from different backgrounds and professions: merchants, lawyers, doctors, writers, scholars, and even some skilled artisans or clerks. This cross-fertilization of perspectives was vital for the development and spread of new ways of thinking. The ideal, often explicitly stated in coffeehouse rules, was for civil discourse and reasoned argument, even when opinions differed sharply. While debates could certainly become heated, the underlying ethos was one of engaging with ideas through logic and evidence rather than through appeals to emotion, tradition, or brute force. Many of the most prominent figures of the Enlightenment were known to be habitués of coffee houses. In London, Joseph Addison and Richard Steele based their influential periodicals, The Tatler and The Spectator, which did much to popularize Enlightenment ideals of politeness, reason, and civic virtue, on the conversations and characters they observed in coffee houses like Will's and Button's. Isaac Newton, Edmund Halley, Robert Hooke, and other fellows of the Royal Society frequently gathered at the Grecian coffee house to discuss their latest experiments and theories. In Paris, cafes like the Procope became legendary meeting places for philosophes such as Voltaire, Diderot, editor of the monumental Encyclopédie, a flagship project of the Enlightenment. Rousseau, though his relationship with coffee house society was often more fraught, and Benjamin Franklin when he was in town. These establishments were not just places to drink coffee. They were informal academies, debating societies, and laboratories for new ideas. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some specific coffee houses became so strongly associated with particular intellectual currents, political factions, or artistic schools of thought that they were essentially the unofficial headquarters or clubhouses for these groups. You might choose your coffee house based on whether you were a Whig or a Tory in politics, a Newtonian or a Cartesian in science, or an admirer of Pope versus Swift in literature. This specialization further intensified the intellectual discussions within those houses. Going to the Grecian today to hear the latest on Halley's Comet calculations, a Londoner might say. Then off to Will's to see if Mr. Dryden has penned any new verses scathing enough to make even the Tories blush. It's going to be a stimulating day, fueled by at least 3 dishes of that excellent new roast from Smyrna. The extent to which coffeehouse discourse directly caused the Enlightenment, versus primarily reflecting and amplifying the broader intellectual and social shifts that were already underway, and just how much genuine free thought and radical critique was truly tolerated in these spaces before attracting unwelcome official attention or censorship, is a nuanced question that historians of ideas and culture continue to explore and debate. It was likely a symbiotic relationship. The Enlightenment provided the ideas, and the coffeehouses provided the ideal caffeinated spaces for those ideas to be discussed, refined, popularized, and spread. The boring but crucial work of the Enlightenment wasn't just about a few great thinkers having eureka moments in isolated studies. It was also about the countless hours of conversation, argument, reading, and reflection that took place in these public, accessible penny universities, where ordinary, though still predominantly educated, and urban men could engage with the most transformative ideas of their age, one stimulating, thought-provoking cup of coffee at a time. Reason itself seemed to find a congenial home in the aromatic steam of the coffee pot. We've seen how the early modern coffee house, fueled by its invigorating signature brew, became a dynamic hub for news, information, and the passionate discussion of the revolutionary ideas that characterized the Age of Enlightenment. But not all coffee houses were created equal, nor did they all cater to the same universal crowd of aspiring intellectuals and news-hungry merchants. Just as today we have different cafes that attract different types of people, the quiet spot for writers, the bustling hub for students, the sleek place for business meetings, so too did the coffee houses of 17th and 18th century Europe begin to specialize, developing distinct characters and attracting specific clienteles based on profession, political affiliation, intellectual interest, or even national origin. Let's now gently wander through a few of these niche cafes, these specialized houses of chat, and see how they further refined and focused the conversations that were reshaping their world. This phenomenon of specialization was particularly pronounced in a vast, teeming metropolis like London, which by the late 17th and early 18th centuries boasted hundreds, if not thousands, of coffee houses. As the number of establishments grew, it was perhaps inevitable that they would begin to differentiate themselves to attract and retain a particular kind of patron. Many Enlightenment-era coffee houses, especially in a sprawling urban center like London with its diverse commercial and intellectual communities, became highly specialized, attracting specific professional, political, or intellectual groups. For example, merchants and ship owners famously congregated at Lloyd's Coffee House, which eventually evolved into the world-renowned insurance market. Lloyd's of London, while prominent writers, poets, and wits like John Dryden and later Joseph Addison and Richard Steele held court at Will's Coffee House and Button's Coffee House, respectively. Imagine yourself as a merchant in late 17th century London, deeply involved in maritime trade. Your first port of call for the latest shipping news, insurance rates, and information about tides, cargoes, and distant ports would undoubtedly be Lloyd's Coffee House on Tower Street, later on Lombard Street. Founded by Edward Lloyd around 1686, this establishment quickly became the recognized center for ship owners, sea captains, underwriters, and anyone else involved in the risky but potentially lucrative business of maritime commerce. Here, amidst the haze of tobacco smoke and the clatter of coffee cups, vital information was exchanged. Insurance policies were negotiated, often written out on the spot, and auctions of ships and their cargoes were held. Lloyd himself facilitated this by providing reliable shipping intelligence and a dedicated space for these transactions. It wasn't just a place to drink coffee, it was an essential nerve center for one of England's most important industries. You wouldn't go to Lloyd's to debate the finer points of Cartesian philosophy. You'd go there to find out if your shipment of Virginia tobacco had safely navigated the pirate-infested waters of the Caribbean, and to get a decent insurance quote before it did. A dish of your best brew. Goodman Lloyd, a nervous merchant, might say, and has there been any word on the sea serpent out of Barbados? My entire fortune in sugarcane is on that vessel, and I hear the French privateers are particularly active this season. If your interests were more literary or theatrical, you might head to Will's Coffee House in Covent Garden. In the late 17th century, Will's was the favored haunt of the great poet and playwright John Dryden and his circle of literary friends and admirers. Aspiring poets would gather here, hoping to catch Dryden's ear, to have their latest verses critiqued or praised, and to participate in the witty, often sharply satirical, literary conversations of the day. Later, in the early 18th century, Button's Coffee House, just across the street, became the preferred meeting place for Joseph Addison, Richard Steele, and their associates, the brilliant essayists behind The Tatler and The Spectator, journals that did so much to shape public taste and manners. At Button's, they even had a special letterbox carved in the shape of a lion's head, where contributors could anonymously submit essays, poems, or pieces of social commentary for potential publication. These literary coffeehouses were crucibles of wit, criticism, and the formation of literary reputations. For those inclined towards the new science, the place to be was often the Grecian Coffee House on Devereux Court, off the Strand. Its proximity to the Royal Society, which often met nearby, made it a natural gathering spot for some of the leading scientific minds of the age, including Isaac Newton, Edmund Halley of comet fame, and Robert Hooke. Here, complex mathematical problems might be scribbled on tables, new astronomical observations discussed, or fierce debates waged over competing scientific theories. A quirky or fringe tidbit, though perhaps apocryphal or exaggerated for dramatic effect, is the famous story that Sir Isaac Newton once dissected a dolphin on one of the tables at the Grecian Coffee House, much to the surprise and probably the olfactory distress of the other patrons, all in the name of scientific inquiry. While the dolphin dissection might be a tall tale, it certainly captures the spirit of hands-on investigation and open discussion that characterize these scientific coffeehouse gatherings. My esteemed colleague, Dr. Halley, Newton might begin, after ordering another dish of coffee. Your calculations regarding the periodicity of that rather impressive comet are most intriguing, but have you factored in the potential for minor orbital perturbations caused by the as-yet undiscovered celestial body beyond Saturn? Let's get another napkin. I have a few equations I'd like to sketch out. Political affiliations also played a significant role in the specialization of coffee houses. Certain establishments became known as gathering places for Whigs, others for Tories. Here, party strategies would be discussed, political pamphlets read and dissected, and alliances forged or broken. The St. James's Coffee House, for example, was a famous Whig haunt, while the Cocoa Tree Coffee House, which, despite its name, also served coffee, was associated with Tories and Jacobites. These weren't just places to debate politics in the abstract. They were active centers of political organization and information exchange for specific factions. Even specific professions or trades might have their favored coffee houses. Lawyers might gather at establishments near the Inns of Court, stock jobbers and financiers at Jonathan's or Garraway's in Exchange Alley, the precursors to the London Stock Exchange, and even specific groups of expatriates or foreigners might find a coffee house that catered to their language and interests. How did this specialization occur? It was likely an organic process. Like-minded individuals, whether by profession, political leaning, or intellectual passion, would naturally gravitate towards each other and find a congenial space to meet. A coffee house keeper, noticing a particular group frequenting his establishment, might then actively cater to their interests, perhaps by subscribing to specific journals or newsletters relevant to that group, or by ensuring a particular corner or room was always available for their discussions. It was good for business, and it fostered a sense of community among the patrons. The benefits of this specialization were numerous. It allowed for deeper, more informed, and more productive discussions within a particular field. If you were a scientist, you could go to the Grecian and be reasonably sure of finding others who understood your work and could offer valuable critique or collaboration. If you were a merchant, Lloyd's offered an unparalleled concentration of maritime and commercial intelligence. These niche cafes became vital nodes in the intellectual and professional networks of their time, fostering innovation, collaboration, and the rapid dissemination of specialized knowledge. The degree of actual exclusivity or rigid cliquishness within these specialized coffee houses, and how truly permeable their social boundaries were to interested outsiders or to individuals of different, though generally still respectable social standing or intellectual persuasion, is a subject that social historians continue to carefully examine by scrutinizing contemporary diaries, private letters, popular satirical literature, and the often very nuanced rules of politeness and social interaction that governed these public spaces. While a newcomer might be welcomed if they showed genuine interest and observed the proper decorum, these specialized houses undoubtedly developed their own distinct cultures and core groups of regulars. So, the coffee house landscape of Enlightenment Europe wasn't just a random scattering of identical establishments. It was a vibrant ecosystem of specialized niches, each with its own unique flavor of conversation, its own dedicated clientele, and its own particular contribution to the intellectual, political, or commercial ferment of the age. Whether you were counting beans of the financial kind or beans of the celestial kind, there was likely a coffee house just for you. A place where you could find your people and your perfect, thought-provoking brew. We've seen how Enlightenment-era coffee houses, with their unique atmosphere and their stimulating signature beverage, became fertile ground for the discussion of new philosophical ideas, and how certain establishments even specialized, attracting specific professional or intellectual groups, like the merchants at Lloyd's or the scientists at the Grecian. This focus on specific interests naturally extended to the realm of science itself. The scientific revolution, that period of profound intellectual upheaval and discovery from roughly the 16th to the 18th centuries, was reaching its zenith just as coffee houses were proliferating across Europe. And these new public spaces played a surprisingly significant, if often informal, role in fostering the very spirit of scientific inquiry, debate, and dissemination that characterized this transformative age. Let's gently peer through the coffee steam and tobacco smoke to observe how Newton's nectar, or perhaps Boyle's brew, fueled the conversations that helped to build the foundations of modern science. The rise of the coffee house coincided beautifully with a new emphasis in natural philosophy, as science was then called on empirical observation, experimentation, the sharing of results, and collaborative inquiry. The old scholastic methods, based largely on deference to ancient authorities like Aristotle, were being challenged by a new generation of thinkers who believed that knowledge of the natural world should be based on direct experience and rational analysis. And the coffee house, with its relatively open and intellectually charged environment, provided an ideal informal setting for this new scientific spirit to flourish. Coffee houses in major European cities like London and Paris, particularly those situated near emerging scientific institutions like the Royal Society of London or the French Académie des Sciences, served as important and remarkably accessible informal venues for scientists, natural philosophers, instrument makers, and interested laymen to meet, to vigorously discuss their latest work and ongoing experiments, to freely share recent discoveries and observations, and to passionately debate new and often controversial theories during the height of the scientific revolution. Imagine yourself in a place like the Grecian Coffee House in London, which, as we've noted, was a famous haunt for many early members of the Royal Society, including such luminaries as Sir Isaac Newton, Edmund Halley, Robert Hooke, and Sir Christopher Wren. Here, over endless dishes of coffee. These intellectual giants, along with lesser-known figures and curious onlookers, could engage in discussions that were often less formal, more wide-ranging, and perhaps even more speculative than what might occur within the official confines of the Royal Society's meetings. They could share the results of recent experiments, describe new astronomical observations made with recently improved telescopes, or demonstrate the workings of new scientific instruments like air pumps or microscopes. Robert Hooke, a brilliant and versatile scientist, was known for bringing his microscope to coffee houses to show patrons the astonishing, previously unseen worlds contained in a drop of water, or the intricate structure of a flea. This wasn't just dry academic presentation, it was science made immediate, tangible, and exciting. Gentlemen, Hook might announce, after carefully adjusting his microscope on a slightly sticky coffeehouse table, prepare to be astounded, for I shall now reveal to you, through the wonders of this optical contrivance, the terrifyingly complex architecture of a common housefly's eye. Another coffee for me, boy. All this magnification is thirsty work. These coffeehouses became crucial spaces for the rapid dissemination and critical discussion of new scientific theories. When Isaac Newton published his groundbreaking Philosophia Naturalis Principia Mathematica in 1687 outlining his laws of motion and universal gravitation, you can be sure it was dissected, debated, and defended with passionate intensity in establishments like the Grecian. Supporters would explain its complex mathematics, skeptics would raise objections, and new converts would marvel at its explanatory power. This kind of open, often robust peer review and public engagement, however informal, was vital for the testing and acceptance of new scientific paradigms. It was science happening in real time, not just in laboratories or university lecture halls. The proximity of many coffee houses to official scientific institutions was no accident. They often sprang up nearby to cater to the scholars, students, and instrument makers associated with these centers of learning. This created a natural synergy. After a formal meeting of the Royal Society, fellows might retire to their favored coffee house to continue their discussions in a more relaxed atmosphere, perhaps joined by other interested parties who weren't official members but were keen to learn about the latest developments. Coffee houses thus acted as important bridges between the formal scientific community and a broader, educated public. They also provided access to scientific publications, early scientific journals, like the Royal Society's Philosophical Transactions, as well as new books on science and mathematics, or even correspondence from foreign scholars detailing discoveries made elsewhere in Europe, might be available for perusal in coffee houses frequented by natural philosophers. This allowed for the relatively quick spread of new knowledge across geographical and institutional boundaries. The coffee itself, as we've continually noted, played a crucial role in facilitating these prolonged and often intellectually demanding scientific discussions. The caffeine-induced alertness, the clarity of thought, the ability to sustain mental effort for hours on end, these were all perfectly suited to the task of grappling with complex mathematical proofs, designing experiments, or debating the very nature of the universe. It's hard to imagine Newton and Leibniz having their famous and often rather heated priority dispute over the invention of calculus while simultaneously trying to outdrink each other with flagons of strong ale. Coffee provided a more conducive fuel for intellectual combat and collaboration. A quirky or fringe tidbit, though one that captures the sometimes surprisingly hands-on and public nature of early science in these venues, is the apocryphal but oft-repeated story of Sir Isaac Newton supposedly dissecting a dolphin or some other large marine creature that had washed ashore or been brought to London as a curiosity on one of the tables of the Grecian coffee house. While the historical accuracy of this specific anecdote is highly doubtful, and the logistics and aroma would have been challenging, to say the least, it does reflect the spirit of empirical inquiry and sometimes rather public demonstration that could occasionally spill over into these informal scientific gathering places. More verifiably, coffee houses were certainly places where new inventions, scientific instruments, or anatomical curiosities might be informally exhibited and discussed. The precise and quantifiable contribution of these coffeehouse discussions to the major scientific breakthroughs of the scientific revolution, as distinct from the more formal research and publications emanating from universities and official scientific societies, and whether coffeehouses primarily served as crucial sites for the rapid dissemination and popularization of new scientific ideas or as actual incubators for significant innovation and discovery, is a nuanced question that continues to be debated and explored by historians of science. It was likely a dynamic interplay formal institutions provided the structure for research and official validation, while coffee houses provided the informal, energetic, and broadly accessible spaces for debate, critique, collaboration, and the wider cultural absorption of new scientific worldviews. So, as you sip your own perhaps decaffeinated beverage and prepare for sleep, imagine the scene: Isaac Newton, a formidable but perhaps socially awkward figure, hunched over a coffeehouse table, sketching equations on a spare piece of paper, while around him, other bewigged gentlemen argue passionately about the nature of light, the existence of a vacuum, or the possibility of life on other planets, a topic of much speculation at the time. Newton's nectar wasn't just a catchy phrase, it was, in many ways, the literal fuel for the minds that were systematically reimagining the very fabric of the cosmos, one stimulating, thought-provoking, and often very bitter cup at a time. The scientific method found a congenial home amidst the clatter of cups and the haze of ideas. We've seen how the early modern coffee house, with its unique atmosphere and its stimulating signature brew, became a fertile ground for the exchange of news, the energetic discussion of political ideas, and even the informal advancement of scientific thought. But the influence of these penny universities didn't stop there. They also became absolutely crucial nexuses for the literary world of the 17th and 18th centuries, for poets, playwrights, essayists, critics, and even the nascent breed of journalists. The coffee house was not just a place to get a warm drink. It was an office, a salon, a stage, a debating hall, and a vital source of inspiration and connection. Let's gently pull up a chair, perhaps at a table already crowded with ink-stained manuscripts and passionate arguers, and listen in as wits and words collided, fueling literary movements and shaping the very language of the age. London, as with so many aspects of early coffeehouse culture, provides some of the most vivid examples of this literary connection. Many prominent literary figures of the late 17th and 18th centuries, such as the poet laureate John Dryden, the essayists Joseph Addison and Richard Steele, and the biting satirist Alexander Pope, were deeply associated with specific London coffeehouses, which served as important, almost indispensable centers for literary discussion, pointed criticism, the formation of literary tastes and reputations, and the practical business of authorship. These weren't just casual hangouts, they were the ecosystems where literary careers were often made or broken. In the later 17th century, Will's Coffee House, located in Covent Garden, rose to particular prominence, largely due to its association with the towering literary figure of John Dryden. Dryden, who was poet laureate and historiographer royal, essentially held court at Will's. He would have his own favored chair, often by the fire in winter or near a window in summer, and aspiring poets, young writers, and established wits would gather there, hoping to catch his attention, to hear his pronouncements on literature and life, and perhaps even to have him deign to read or comment upon their own fledgling verses. To receive a nod of approval from Dryden at Will's could launch a young writer's career. To be the subject of his critical scorn could be devastating. The conversations here would have been sharp, witty, often highly critical, and intensely focused on matters of style, taste, classical precedent, and contemporary literary production. Imagine a young poet, trembling slightly, approaching Dryden's inner circle, manuscript clutched in his sweaty palm, hoping for a word of encouragement that might elevate him from obscurity. "Mr. Dryden, sir," he might stammer. "If your eminence would but glance at my humble ode on the peculiar dietary habits of the common garden slug, I feel it has a certain earthy realism." Dryden, after a sip of coffee and a puff of his pipe, might then deliver a verdict that could make or break the young man's week, if not his entire literary ambition. As the 18th century dawned, the literary epicenter in London shifted slightly, with Button's Coffee House, just across Russell Street from Will's, becoming the favored haunt of Joseph Addison and Richard Steele. These two brilliant essayists were the creative forces behind the highly influential periodicals, The Tatler, 1709-1711, and The Spectator, 1711-1712, with a brief revival in 1714. These journals, with their witty observations on contemporary manners, morals, and culture, their gently satirical character sketches, and their promotion of politeness, reason, and civic virtue, were hugely popular and did much to shape the literary taste and social ideals of the Augustan age. And Button's was their unofficial headquarters. A quirky or fringe tidbit associated with buttons is the famous lion's head letterbox that Addison had installed there. The lion's mouth was the slot for contributions, and patrons were invited to anonymously submit essays, poems, letters, or pieces of social commentary, some of which might then be selected by Addison and Steele for publication in The Spectator. It was an early analog form of crowdsourcing content, and it made buttons a hive of literary aspiration and contribution. You can picture aspiring writers eagerly dropping their manuscripts into the lion's fearsome jaws, hoping their words might soon grace the pages of London's most fashionable journal. Of course, London wasn't the only city where coffee and literature formed a potent partnership. In Parisian cafes like the Café Procope, which opened its doors in 1686 and still exists today, a venerable literary landmark, similar scenes unfolded. The Procope became a legendary meeting place for many of the leading figures of the French Enlightenment, philosophers and writers such as Voltaire. Rousseau, though his relationship with Parisian society was famously complicated and often contentious. Diderot, the driving force behind the monumental Encyclopédie, Montesquieu, and later even visiting American luminaries like Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson. Here, amidst the clatter of cups and the passionate Glycan debate, new ideas about literature, philosophy, politics, and social reform were forged and sharpened. These cafes were intellectual hothouses, where a well-turned phrase or a devastating piece of satire could make a reputation or dismantle an opponent's argument more effectively than any duel at dawn. Monsieur Voltaire seems particularly sparkling. This morning, an observer at the Procope might note, "I believe he has just composed 17 new epigrams eviscerating the Academy's latest pronouncements on tragic drama, all before finishing his first dish of coffee. The man is a caffeinated whirlwind of wit." How exactly did these coffee houses foster literary production and shape literary culture? They provided a physical space to write. For many writers, especially those who were not wealthy, a coffee house offered a relatively cheap, warm, or at least warmer than a cold garret, and stimulating environment in which to work. For the price of a dish of coffee, you could sit for hours, read, observe, and put quill to paper. They were unparalleled venues for discussion and instant feedback. A writer could try out new ideas, read passages from a work in progress, or engage in critical debate with fellow authors and discerning patrons. This immediate, often unsparing, peer review could be invaluable for honing one's craft, refining arguments, and gauging potential audience reaction. They were a rich source of inspiration. The sheer diversity of people and conversations in a busy coffee house offered a living tapestry of human nature, a constant stream of characters, anecdotes, social observations, and current events that a keen-eyed writer could draw upon for their work. Addison and Steele, for instance, explicitly based many of their spectator essays on the types of people and discussions they encountered in London's coffee houses. They were crucial for networking. Writers could meet potential patrons, booksellers, publishers, and printers. They could form literary circles or schools, collaborate on projects, or simply find companionship and support among like-minded individuals. Literary reputations were often built as much on coffeehouse wit and connections as on published works. The coffeehouse was also central to the rise of periodicals and literary journals. Many of these publications, like the Tatler and the Spectator, were not only conceived and often written in coffeehouses, but they were also primarily distributed and read within them. They reflected the conversational style, the intellectual curiosity, and the diverse interests of the coffeehouse clientele. They helped to create a shared literary culture and a reading public that extended beyond the narrow confines of the universities or the aristocratic salons. The extent to which the informal literary criticism and often boisterous collaborative discussions that took place within these coffee houses genuinely and directly shaped the final published form of major Enlightenment literary works, versus the more traditional, solitary processes of writing. Revision and formal editorial input is a complex question that literary historians and authorial biographers continue to explore through the careful analysis of surviving letters, diaries, manuscript drafts, and contemporary accounts of literary life. It was likely a dynamic interplay, with the coffee house providing a crucial sounding board, a source of stimulation, and a vital connection to the pulse of the reading public. Even if the final polishing of a masterpiece often happened in quieter, more private settings, the boring but absolutely essential process of literary creation, the drafting and redrafting, the arguments over word choice, the search for the perfect metaphor, the endless discussions about form and content, all found a congenial, if sometimes chaotic, home in the Enlightenment coffee house, the Enlightenment. It was a place where words mattered immensely, where wit was a currency, and where the next great poem, play, or philosophical essay might be brewing right alongside the next dish of strong, black coffee. The muses, it seemed, had developed a taste for caffeine. We've savored the atmosphere of Enlightenment coffee houses as vibrant hubs for news, philosophical debate, and literary creation. But these penny universities weren't just for high-minded intellectuals, aspiring poets, or news-hungry citizens. They also played an absolutely crucial, if sometimes less glamorously depicted, role in the world of commerce, finance, and everyday business. For merchants, traders, ship owners, insurers, stock jobbers, and all manner of entrepreneurs, the coffee house became an indispensable office, meeting room, information exchange, and marketplace, all lubricated by the stimulating new brew. Let's gently count the beans, both literal and metaphorical, and see how coffee houses helped to fuel the burgeoning commercial capitalism of the 17th and 18th centuries. Many of the earliest and most successful coffee houses were strategically located in or near the bustling business districts of major European cities. In London, numerous establishments sprang up in the city, around the Royal Exchange, near the Custom House, and along the Thames where ships docked. In Amsterdam, Paris, and other trading centers, a similar pattern emerged. This proximity to the centers of commerce made them natural gathering places for men of business. Instead of trying to conduct deals in a noisy, crowded, and often ale-soaked tavern, or relying on chance encounters in the street or at the exchange, merchants and financiers found that the coffee house offered a more conducive environment, relatively quiet at least, compared to a tavern, sober, and filled with a constant flow of potentially useful information and contacts. "I'll meet you at Garraway's after the change closes," one merchant might say to another. "We can discuss that shipment of Virginia tobacco over a dish of coffee, and perhaps see if there's any news on the East India Company's stock." For merchants and traders, the coffee house was an invaluable resource. Here, they could read the latest shipping news, arrivals and departures of vessels, reports on tides and weather, information about freight rates and insurance costs. They could peruse commercial newsletters and price currents that listed the going rates for various commodities, from wool and wheat to sugar, spices, and slaves. They could meet with ship captains just returned from distant voyages, eager to share first-hand information about market conditions in foreign ports or potential new trading opportunities. They could negotiate contracts, form partnerships, arrange financing for voyages, and settle accounts, all within the relatively informal but information-rich environment of their favored coffee house. It was a place to see and be seen, to build a reputation for reliability and shrewdness, and to gather the crucial intelligence needed to navigate the risky but potentially rewarding world of early modern commerce. Perhaps the most famous examples of coffee houses evolving into major financial institutions come from London. Several major and world-renowned financial institutions, most notably Lloyd's of London, the global insurance market, and crucial precursors to the formal London Stock Exchange, such as the famous Jonathan's Coffee House and Garraway's Coffee House in Exchange Alley, originated or developed significantly within the unique, information-rich, and transaction-friendly environment of 17th and 18th century London coffee houses. Lloyd's Coffee House, established by Edward Lloyd around 1686 initially on Tower Street and later moving to Lombard Street, began as a gathering place for those involved in maritime trade, ship owners, sea captains, merchants, and, importantly, individuals willing to underwrite or insure shipping voyages against loss. Lloyd facilitated this by providing a reliable source of shipping news. He eventually published Lloyd's List, a journal of maritime intelligence. Starting in 1734, which still exists today in a different form, and a convenient venue for these parties to meet and transact business. Men wishing to insure a ship or its cargo would circulate a slip of paper detailing the voyage and the sum to be insured. And various underwriters present in the coffee house would sign their names underneath, hence underwriter, indicating the portion of the risk they were willing to take on in exchange for a premium. Over time, this informal system of individuals meeting in a coffee house to share risk evolved into the highly organized global insurance market that is Lloyd's of London. It all started with coffee, conversation, and the need to protect oneself from the perils of the sea. You can almost hear a nervous ship owner. Right, I need to insure the Sea Serpent for her voyage to Barbados. She's carrying a full cargo of woolen nightcaps and my mother-in-law's prize-winning fruitcakes. Who's willing to underwrite this perilous venture coffees on me if she makes it back in one piece? Fruitcakes mercifully lost at sea, just a short walk away, in Exchange Alley. Coffee houses like Jonathan's and Garraway's became the unofficial and often rather chaotic centers for the buying and selling of company shares, government securities, lottery tickets, and other financial instruments. This was the very early unregulated beginnings of a stock market. Stock jobbers, brokers, investors, and speculators would gather in these crowded, noisy establishments, eagerly exchanging information and rumors, making deals, and sometimes participating in frenzied speculative bubbles, like the infamous South Sea Bubble of 1720, which saw fortunes made and lost with bewildering speed. Much of the mania fueled by the intense atmosphere of these financial coffee houses, Garraway's was also famous for holding auctions of various goods, including ships, wine, and even beaver pelts from North America. Beyond these specialized financial coffee houses, many others served as venues for auctions of all kinds of goods: property, household items, books, art, even sometimes enslaved people, a grim reminder of the pervasiveness of that trade. The coffee house provided a convenient public space, a ready audience of potential buyers, and perhaps a certain level of trust facilitated by the coffee house keeper or the regular patrons. The boring but absolutely essential infrastructure for business that coffee houses provided cannot be overstated. They offered a neutral and relatively accessible meeting place, away from private homes or offices, where deals could be discussed, access to a constant flow of information, printed news, handwritten newsletters, word-of-mouth intelligence, crucial for making informed business decisions, a forum for establishing business relationships, trust, and personal reputation. In an era with limited formal credit rating systems, a merchant's good name, often cultivated through his regular presence and honest dealings in a particular coffee house, was his most valuable asset. Conversely, a known scoundrel or a bankrupt might find himself unwelcome. Basic amenities: a warm place to sit, a cheap and stimulating beverage, perhaps even writing materials, ink, quills, paper for drafting contracts or correspondence. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some coffee houses that catered to specific trades or mercantile interests might have kept specialized ledgers, price lists for particular commodities relevant to their clientele, like cotton, sugar, or tobacco, or even detailed maps of trade routes or foreign ports displayed on their walls. They acted as informal information bureaus and resource centers for their particular industry. It was all about providing value to their patrons, ensuring they kept coming back for their coffee, their news, and their business networking. The degree to which the informal, often highly unregulated, and sometimes rumor-driven financial dealings that took place within these early coffee houses directly contributed to genuine economic innovation and long-term capital formation, versus their potential for fostering unsustainable speculative bubbles. Outright fraud and market instability, as seen with the South Sea Bubble, is a complex and ongoing subject of debate among economic historians. They were undoubtedly dynamic, but also, at times, dangerously volatile spaces for financial activity. So as you sip your own calming beverage, imagine the intense, caffeinated buzz of Jonathan's coffee house in Exchange Alley, the air thick with the shouts of stock jobbers, the rustle of share certificates, and the aroma of coffee beans being ground alongside the fortunes being made and lost. These penny universities weren't just for philosophers and poets. They were also the bustling, bean-counting counting houses of an emerging capitalist world, where the deals that shaped empires were often struck one dish of coffee at a time. We've seen the early modern coffee house blossom into a remarkable institution, a penny university for the masses. An information superhighway, albeit one paved with news sheets and powered by word of mouth, a crucible for Enlightenment ideas, a hub for literary wits, a laboratory for scientific debate, and even an unofficial stock exchange and insurance market. These establishments, fueled by the novel, stimulating, and relatively sober beverage of coffee, were fostering a new kind of public discourse, a new level of social interaction, and a new sense of intellectual and commercial dynamism. But as you can imagine, not everyone was thrilled with this development. The very freedom of thought and expression, the relatively open mingling of different social classes, and the often unfettered discussion of political and religious matters that characterized coffeehouse culture made them objects of deep suspicion and considerable anxiety for the ruling authorities of the day. Let's now gently explore the royal jitters and the various attempts made by kings and governments to control, suppress, or at least keep a very wary eye on these potentially seditious hotbeds of talk. The primary concern for most governments, particularly in the more absolutist or monarchical states of 17th and 18th century Europe, was the fear of sedition and public disorder. Several European governments in the 17th and 18th centuries, deeply concerned about the potential for coffee houses to become breeding grounds for seditious talk, political dissent, and public unrest, made concerted attempts to suppress, heavily regulate, or at least closely monitor these popular establishments. Though these efforts were often met with significant public resistance and were largely unsuccessful in permanently curtailing coffeehouse culture, in these coffee houses, private citizens were gathering in unprecedented numbers, reading uncensored, or at least less easily controlled news, openly discussing affairs of state, criticizing government policies, and even questioning the actions and authority of the monarch or the established church. From the perspective of a king who believed in his divine right to rule, or a government that prized absolute obedience and social stability above all else. This was a dangerous development. Coffee houses could become echo chambers for discontent, places where political factions could meet and plot, where radical ideas could spread like wildfire, and where rumors, true or false, could quickly incite public unrest or even riots. The coffee wasn't just waking people up, it was waking them up to new political possibilities. And that made many rulers distinctly nervous. What's this I hear about the Turk's Head coffee house? A concerned monarch might ask his chief of police. They say the patrons are discussing Mr. Locke's rather unsettling notions about natural rights and government by consent. This sounds dangerously like my thinking we must put a stop to it. Perhaps we could replace their coffee with warm milk and a nice, soporific lute player. One of the most famous and ultimately unsuccessful attempts at suppression came in England under King Charles II. In 1675, Charles issued a proclamation for the suppression of coffee houses. The official reasons given were that these establishments distracted tradesmen from their work, that the coffee itself was a base, black, thick, nasty, bitter, stinking, nauseous puddle water, a rather unflattering review, even by 17th century standards. And, most tellingly, that they were places where divers false, malicious, and scandalous reports are devised and spread abroad to the defamation of His Majesty's government and to the disturbance of the peace and quiet of the realm. The proclamation ordered all coffee houses to be closed down. However, this move was met with such a massive public outcry, particularly from the merchants and businessmen who relied on coffee houses for their daily operations, and perhaps also from a populace that had grown rather fond of its daily caffeine fix, that the king was forced to withdraw the proclamation just a few days later, before it could even be fully implemented. It was a clear demonstration of the coffee house's popularity and their already entrenched role in urban life. The people had spoken, or rather grumbled very loudly over their last legally permissible dishes of coffee, and the king had to listen. While outright banning often proved impractical or politically unwise, governments employed other methods to try and control or monitor what went on within coffeehouse walls. Licensing and taxation were common tools. Coffee house keepers would be required to obtain a license to operate, which could be revoked if their establishment was deemed too disorderly or a center of seditious talk. Taxes were levied on coffee itself and on the licenses, providing revenue for the state, but also making the beverage more expensive and perhaps less accessible to some. Surveillance was another key tactic. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that many coffee houses, particularly those known for political debate or frequented by known dissidents, were often infiltrated by government spies or informers. These individuals would sit quietly, nursing a dish of coffee, their ears open for any seditious remarks, any plots against the state, or any unauthorized criticism of the king or his ministers. They would then report their findings back to the authorities. This created an atmosphere where, despite the ideal of free discussion, patrons often had to be careful about what they said and to whom, especially on sensitive political or religious topics. Knowing that the bewigged gentleman at the next table, seemingly engrossed in his copy of the London Gazette, might actually be on the payroll of the Secretary of State, would certainly add a frisson of paranoia to your debate about the divine right of kings. I find your arguments against the latest turnip tariff most compelling, sir. One might say, while subtly checking if the aforementioned gentleman was taking notes. Though perhaps we should discuss the weather. It's been remarkably non-seditious. Lately, in France, under absolutist monarchs like Louis XIV and his successors, the authorities were also deeply suspicious of cafés, the French equivalent of coffee houses, as potential breeding grounds for dissent. The Parisian police employed a network of spies known as mouche flies to frequent cafés and report on conversations. Strict censorship laws governed printed materials, and café owners could be held responsible for any illicit or seditious pamphlets found on their premises. Yet, despite these efforts, Parisian cafés, like their London counterparts, became vibrant centers for Enlightenment thought, philosophical debate, and eventually, the revolutionary ideas that would erupt in 1789. In some German states, the official response to coffee was sometimes even more extreme, driven by economic protectionism to protect local beer industries as much as by political fear. Frederick the Great of Prussia, for example, tried to discourage coffee consumption in favor of beer, which he considered more manly and better for his soldiers and tax revenues from local breweries. A rather amusing, quirky fact is that in some of these German states, special coffee sniffers, Kaffeeriker, were employed by the government. Their job was to literally walk the streets, sniffing the air for the aroma of illicitly roasted coffee beans, as private roasting was often forbidden or heavily taxed to protect state monopolies on coffee. Imagine that on your resume, professional coffee sniffer, proficient in detecting unauthorized mocha java from up to 3 city blocks away. Despite these various attempts at suppression and control, the coffee house phenomenon proved remarkably resilient. They were simply too popular, too numerous, and too deeply embedded in the commercial, social, and intellectual life of European cities to be easily eradicated. The demand for coffee, and for the unique environment that coffee houses provided, was too strong. Moreover, the very nature of coffee house discourse, its fluidity, its informality, its reliance on myriad individual conversations, made it very difficult for authorities to effectively police everything that was said. Historians continue to debate whether governmental attempts to suppress or regulate coffee houses in early modern Europe were primarily driven by genuine and well-founded fears of political sedition and potential social disorder, or if they were motivated more by underlying economic concerns related to controlling trade and maximizing tax revenues from popular commodities, or even by broader moral anxieties about perceived idleness. The disruption of traditional social hierarchies, and the rise of a more critical and independent public opinion. It was likely a potent mixture of all these royal jitters. What is clear is that the authorities recognized, often with considerable alarm, that something new and powerful was emerging from these smoky, caffeinated rooms. The coffee house, by fostering a space for relatively free and sober discussion among a wider range of people, was helping to create a more informed, more critical, and ultimately more assertive public. And that, for many rulers of the Ancien Regime, was a very unsettling brew indeed. Our sleepy exploration of the Enlightenment coffee house That penny university and crucible of new ideas is now drawing towards its final fragrant drop. We've seen how this novel institution, fueled by an exotic new beverage, transformed social interaction, facilitated the spread of news and knowledge, and provided a unique space for intellectual, political, commercial, and even scientific discourse. We've also acknowledged the attempts by anxious authorities to control or suppress these vibrant hubs of conversation. But before we let the steam from our historical coffee cup entirely dissipate, it's important to consider who wasn't typically part of this bustling, caffeinated scene. While coffee houses were in many ways more democratic and accessible than previous public forums, their doors were not, in practice, open to everyone. Understanding these exclusions gives us a more complete and nuanced picture of this important Enlightenment institution and its societal impact. Perhaps the most significant group largely excluded from the public life of most early modern European coffee houses, particularly in England, was women, despite their reputation as relatively open public spaces for discourse. Early modern European coffee houses, especially in Protestant countries like England and the Netherlands, were overwhelmingly male-dominated environments, and access for respectable women was generally limited by strong social conventions. Prevailing gender norms that emphasized female domesticity and concerns about propriety and reputation. While women certainly consumed coffee and later tea, which became very fashionable among women in domestic settings, the public coffee house, with its boisterous debates, its thick haze of tobacco smoke, its sometimes rough and tumble commercial dealings, and its exclusively male clientele, was generally not considered an appropriate or safe space for women of good standing. For a woman to be seen frequenting such an establishment unaccompanied or mingling too freely with the male patrons could seriously damage her reputation, exposing her to accusations of immodesty or even loose morals. Good heavens! Did you see Mistress Prudence enter Jonathan's coffee house all by herself? A shocked observer might whisper, whatever could she be thinking next? She'll be demanding the vote or expecting to understand stock jobbing. The world is surely ending. There were, of course, exceptions. Women who actually owned or worked in coffee houses, perhaps as the widow of a former proprietor, or as a serving girl, were a necessary presence, though their role was one of service rather than equal participation in the discourse. In some continental European cities, particularly Paris, the café culture that evolved was perhaps a little more accommodating to women, especially in later periods or in establishments that also served other refreshments like chocolate or lemonade and had a more salon-like atmosphere. But even there, the dominant intellectual and political discussions were primarily conducted by men. Women who wished to participate in intellectual life often did so in different, more private venues, such as the aristocratic salons, especially in France, which were often hosted and presided over by influential women, or within their own domestic circles and correspondence networks. This exclusion of women from the mainstream coffeehouse culture meant that a significant portion of the population was not directly participating in this burgeoning public sphere, at least not in the same way men were. Their perspectives, their voices, their contributions to the Enlightenment conversation had to find other, often less public channels. A famous, if likely satirical, quirky, or fringe tidbit from 1674 is the Women's Petition Against Coffee, a pamphlet published in London in which women supposedly complained that coffee made their husbands unfruitful and led them to neglect their domestic duties in favor of idly gossiping in coffee houses, where they have self-government and club law and get intoxicated with a dark, thick, nasty, bitter, stinking, nauseous puddle water. Nay, while probably penned by a man for humorous or misogynistic effect, it does reflect a contemporary awareness of coffee houses as male-dominated spaces and perhaps some female resentment towards these new establishments that were luring men away from home. Another significant group largely excluded from the penny university was, quite simply, the very poor. While the penny admission fee for a dish of coffee was indeed remarkably cheap compared to, say, the cost of books or university tuition, for those at the absolute bottom of the socioeconomic ladder, the destitute, the vagrant, the unskilled casual laborer living hand-to-mouth, even a penny could be a significant sum, especially if it meant sacrificing a portion of their meager food budget. Moreover, these individuals would likely not have the leisure time to spend hours in a coffee house, nor perhaps the literacy skills or the specific kinds of knowledge that were valued in coffee house discourse. The democracy of the coffee house had its economic and educational thresholds. Depending on the specific city and period, certain religious or ethnic minorities might also have faced informal or even formal exclusion from mainstream coffee houses, or they might have chosen to congregate in their own specific establishments if permitted. In a world where religious and ethnic tensions were often high, the ideal of a perfectly open, tolerant space for all was not always realized in practice. And while news was often read aloud for the benefit of the illiterate, full and equal participation in the vibrant print culture of the coffee house, the reading of diverse newspapers, pamphlets, and political tracts, and perhaps even contributing written pieces to the Lion's Head letterbox at Buttons, was naturally limited for those who could not read or write with ease. Literacy rates were improving during the Enlightenment, but a significant portion of the population, especially in the lower classes, remained illiterate or semi-literate. The extent to which coffee houses actively policed their own social and intellectual boundaries against undesirable or unqualified patrons, for example, through informal social pressure from regular customers, the subtle or overt discouragement by the coffee house keeper, or by simply cultivating an atmosphere that was intellectually intimidating or unwelcoming to certain individuals, versus their social composition being passively shaped by the natural self-selection of their clientele based on factors like cost, location, shared interests, and prevailing cultural norms, is a complex and nuanced aspect of their social history that historians continue to explore. It wasn't necessarily about formal bouncers at the door, but more about the unwritten rules of who belonged and who felt comfortable participating in that specific environment. So, while the coffee house undoubtedly represented a significant step towards a more open and participatory public sphere compared to what had existed before, it's crucial for our sleepy understanding to remember its limitations and its exclusions. The buzz of coffee house culture, the stimulating exchange of ideas that fueled so much of the Enlightenment, was primarily experienced by a specific, if expanding, segment of society largely urban, predominantly male, and generally literate men of the middling and upper sorts. The voices of women, the very poor, and many other marginalized groups were, for the most part, to be found elsewhere, if they were heard publicly at all. This doesn't diminish the coffee house's historical importance, but it does provide a more complete and boring in the sense of being realistic and nuanced picture of its actual place in the complex social tapestry of early modern Europe. And so, our sleepy journey through the aromatic, bustling, and intellectually charged world of the Enlightenment coffee house draws to its final, gentle drop. We've traced the coffee bean's exotic trek to European shores, stepped inside those penny universities, listened to the murmur of news and the passionate cadences of philosophical debate, and seen how these unique establishments fueled not just minds but also commerce, literature, science, and political discourse. We've also acknowledged the jitters they caused in royal courts and the closed doors that limited their otherwise revolutionary openness. The coffee house, it is clear, was far more than just a place to drink a novel beverage. It was a crucible of modernity, a space where the very foundations of a new age were being laid. One conversation, one argument, one caffeinated insight at a time, as the image of those smoke-filled rooms, with their bewigged patrons hunched over newspapers and their endless dishes of coffee, begins to soften and recede into the mists of history. Allow the legacy of these engines of enlightenment to settle gently in your mind. The intense debates have quieted. The printing presses have long since cooled. The specific controversies that once animated those rooms are now the domain of historians. Yet the echoes of that era and the enduring impact of the coffee house as a new kind of public space remain with us. There are no more philosophical treatises to dissect tonight, no more stock prices to haggle over, no more seditious pamphlets to discreetly pass under the table. There is only the quiet invitation to your own peaceful and well-deserved rest. Feel the gentle rhythm of your own breathing, a calm and steady tide, carrying you further from the shores of wakefulness and into the serene waters of slumber. The vibrant energy of the coffee house can now give way to the deep tranquility of the night. May your dreams be filled with clarity and insight, and your rest be as restorative and profound as the most perfectly brewed cup of historical understanding. Sweet dreams.